See, the numbers just started going up, so that means you're just starting to come into the room. And I can imagine you in your beautiful faces coming into this space, even though I can't see you. We are here wrapping up, I think, week 47 of our webinar series, Staying Strong and Positive for Ourselves and Our Children. We've been going strong since last March. So I would appreciate it is as you come into the room, if you could open the webinar chat and do like Tammy has done and Alexandra and me, and click on when it says two, there's a drop-down menu, and the second option should say all panelists and attendees, or everyone, depending on your Zoom. And if you can really, if you can click that one instead of the first one, that will help in terms of the interactivity planned for today. So welcome, Felicia. Great, thanks for joining us. Glenda from Newark, it's wonderful. Andrew's here from Minnesota. May from Akron. I'm recognizing friends' names. People I have never met, but I recognize your names. It's wonderful to have you here with us this Friday. We're going to get started in about 20 seconds. Hi, Jennifer from California. I told you, Alexandra, that Jennifer Johnson was joining. And Maxine from snowy New Jersey. Yeah, I heard the East Coast is getting it hard. Don't worry, it's just a couple days. We feel badly also, or send our thoughts and prayers to people in Texas too, who are without water and some without power. Marchetta, welcome. Dorothy, welcome from North Carolina. So it's noon and we're going to get started. Selena Ornelas is in the background. She's our fantastic tech support today. And I'm here. Alexandra is presenting, and we are celebrating Black History Month today. And our topic is celebrating family and community sustainability, because as many of you know who have been on our other webinars this month, sustainability is our focus for the month. And a lot of times when people think about sustainability, they think about environmental sustainability, or they think about the planet and how can we sustain life on Earth. And we've had a lot of webinars related to that. But sustainability is about being able to keep it going. And we felt that Black History Month is all about the resilience and the sustainability of African American families and communities. So Alexandra is our presenter for today, and I'm going to be backing her up as the host. I'll be reading the chat. And this is to remind you that the chat is the major way to engage. And that's why you need to put it to all panelists and attendees. So Norma, Dorothy, if you can check your settings and just make sure it's the second on the drop-down menu so that it's all panelists and attendees. So everybody can see it, because that way, if we're going to have interactivity, you all want to be able to read what each other are saying. So, and Tammy says the snow pile across the street in the church parking lot is so tall the kids are able to stand on top of the basketball hoop. They're making me nervous. Wow. That is tall. The second thing is, if you want to say something, you want to be heard, not in the chat, you can raise your hand and Selena will unmute you, and then you will unmute yourself, and then you'll be able to speak. So welcome, welcome, welcome. And before we turn it over to Alexandra, just to remind everybody that we have agreements. So these are our agreements. It's basically, we co-create this safe space together for all of us to be able to be vulnerable and expand. So if you agree to these agreements, do like Felicia, but Felicia, make it to all panelists and attendees. Maxine, Tammy, Alexandra, May, Amanda, make it to all panelists and attendees. Rose, make it to all panelists and attendees. Just reminding, just because I can see all of you, but you all can only see a few of you. So without further, I'm going to turn it over. Thank you, Alexandra, for being here. Thank you for working so much on this and preparing the presentation for us today. And let's go.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Happy to be here. Of course, this is something that's always near and dear to my heart, as I was an African American Studies major at Howard University. So this is something I'm very passionate about. So we're going to start off with a quote about the resilience and legacy of Black families. It's from one of my favorite authors, who many of you may be familiar with. Dr. Joy, she wrote the book Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and has done a lot of research around the effects of slavery, not just in a negative light, but the resilience and the strength that's come out of it. And so I think that this quote sets the tone for what we'll be talking about today. And it says that, Black families have a wealthy store of memories about struggle, perseverance, and victory, replete with the usual host of characters that are included in such accounts. The antagonists, along with the villains, along with the heroes and the heroines, provided colorful depictions of our family tapestry. We, the elders, only have to speak. We owe it to them to tell our stories and to encourage them to tell their own. By so doing, we build continuity across the generations, and with greater continuity will come a growing understanding of and confidence in our power to survive, overcome, and flourish. So I think that just really sums up what this concept of sustainability and exactly what Katthe is saying, not from just an environmental perspective, but from a legacy and resilience and strength perspective. Next slide, please. So Black cultural strengths and psychosocial well-being, we wanted to add something that's research-based to kind of explain what we're talking about and what's been studied about Black strength and Black resilience. And so this study, which you can see at the bottom, came out of the 2019 Journal of Black Psychology. And they highlighted four things. It was an extensive study, but they highlighted four things as the strengths that contributed to the psychosocial well-being of African American families. First was racial identity. And the way that they couched the racial identity was the positive thoughts about one's identity, but it also was more so about how it's reflected as pride and an investment into culture. And when that is present, then there is these psycho health benefits, right? It mitigates depression, it increases well-being, it increases self-esteem. A lot of times we hear about Black racial identity, or in these conversations that we have about equity and diversity, people are always talking about internalized racism. But what this study brought up was the other side of that, not focusing on that, but the other side of that. Despite the experiences of African Americans in this country, they have a sense of pride and cultural investment that has been passed on from our culture, which they called Afro-cultural values, from our experiences and culture in Africa. And so the next thing that they talked about was Black racial socialization, and it was directly related to Black racial identity in the sense that we are socialized, African American families, individuals, and children, through our parents, through our extended family members, and then through the broader community. And this happens in a way that is positive in spite of, again, the experiences that we've experienced, and especially mitigates and increases self-esteem and mitigates depression if the person who's receiving the socialization, so the children, are already have some foundation and level of cultural investment. So if they were taught, or in their home they see images that are make them feel good about African Americans and the achievements, then they're more receptive to this racial socialization that operates outside of the oppression. Also, it says that the parents then communicate positive messages to children, and in the way that they communicate the positive messages kind of sets the tone for the rest of the children's life, which goes into what we're talking about today, right? If we talk about Black history, not just in February, which Katthe and I are committed to doing more of this throughout the year, because it doesn't have to be limited to February. But if children, young children, African American children, are taught Black history in the light of positivity and in resilience, it affects the trajectory of their life and their self-esteem for the rest of their life. And then another cultural strength that they found was communalism and cultural spirituality. And so communalism is something that's still definitely, again, rooted in African culture. And it's that the success of the individual is inseparable to the with the success of the group. So they're inextricably bound. They have to be coexisting. There's not one without the other. Also, it talked about that preserving like the family systems. And we're going to talk about this a little bit different, that our family systems within the African American culture is based on beyond blood ties. It's based on also social supports. So the Black church, right, which has been in African American culture, a place of social support and economic support within the Black community. And I hear there's this really good, I haven't seen it yet, PBS special about the Black church. So I don't know if anyone has looked at it. It's an ongoing series that's been happening like the last week or two. And then it talks about the cultural spirituality, not based on religion. Religion is a part of it. Of course, the Black church is a Christian, but it also talked about this connection to one's ancestors that even happens in the context of African Americans who are Christian, but that is still a remnant of us retaining culture from traditional African spiritual systems where ancestor reverence, a lot of times people confuse it with worship, it is not. Ancestor reverence is very much a part of those spiritual traditions. And when you look at the history of African people as African Americans, but in the diaspora, you see that play out in some of the diasporic religions that have been birthed, like Santeria, Lukumi, Voodoo, which is a lot in New Orleans. And then even in the American South, a lot of people don't know, but it's called quote unquote hoodoo. And so for I have any African Americans here, you know, there's like little sayings like, or little attributes that are passed down that you should do when someone dies. Or I'll give you one as simple as what we make on New Year's Eve, right? Some of the dishes have like spiritual meanings. The fact that we call sweet potatoes yams, even though they're two different species, all of those things that have been transmitted generation to generation. And so that cultural spirituality as a value is broader than just religion. It's a spiritual cultural transmission. And then lastly, they talked about racism related coping. And this is the one that Katthe and I both found very interesting. And what it says that, again, that the Black cultural values have been maintained, not because of our contact with white culture and the experiences that we have, but in spite of, that we've been able to maintain this racial identity. And also, oddly enough, that the coping mechanisms, expressing our anger about the social injustice that we feel, expressing our pride at the same time, and then talking to our kids about that, having this activism mentality, which, you know, it's just basically throughout all of African American history, sometimes in very subtle ways, not even in big movements, just in daily life, that all of those coping mechanisms, that it is actually a strength. So when Katthe and I were talking, it's like, you know, a lot of times people say being angry is not good. But actually, what they found in this study is that having a healthy sense of anger in reaction to oppression and injustice helps, again, increase the psychosocial well-being of African Americans. And that's really how we've been able to be resilient with the history that we've experienced in this country. Next slide, please.
Wait, can I just say something?
Sure.
Because I think that's like, it's really deep and true. What the psychosocial well-being piece is, that if you're not angry, or if you're not taught as a child that when you experience racism, that it's wrong and that you have the right to feel upset about it, and that, you know, then it's gaslighting, kind of like, then that's what makes you take on the negative perception as your self-perception. So it's kind of like what I see in the image that was coming to me is, sometimes, remember how we used to do that key with the protective factors, that the protective factors, you can are the light in the home, and you can build that light in the home to protect against what goes on in the outside
Yes.
world that you can't control. So if the other has a negative perception of you, but you learn in the home that you're amazing, that you're beautiful, that you're strong, that you come from kings, that you that and that it's a good thing, like you the foods and the art and the spirituality, and you come with that in your family and community. It's like a vaccination against
Yeah.
against you know the negativity that otherwise you would be infected by, you know
That, I mean,
like
and that's extremely true, Katthe, because for me personally, I was taught to be prideful, etc. But it wasn't until I was 12 when I actually started really digging into history and became a student that some of those beauty standards just fell away. I mean, at 12 and 13, I was like, wait a minute, wait a minute. And so I didn't really experience even the normal teenage self-esteem issues because I was so engulfed in the beauty, the pride, and like countering because I was angry, right? That I hadn't learned some of this stuff, countering that. So I know that from a personal standpoint, that when we teach our children, not just to be prideful because you're African American, but specifically to go into understanding our history and culture, it changes the whole trajectory of your mind and your self-esteem. So, right, that was the science done right by some Black psychologists. So now we're going to get kind of to like the practical and what we know just as students of history and experiencing our own experiences with our friends who have Black families or ourselves if you're African American on this call. So one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that the protective factors were embedded into African American culture before they were called protective factors, right? Before we had named this thing. And knowledge of parenting and child development, when Katthe and I was letting her review this, we were talking about it, and we were like, well, there's not really much to put in there because it's kind of embedded in the rest of the protective factors that we highlight. So resilience, right? Many may know that after the end of enslavement in this country, families enduring enslavement, if someone was somehow had bought their freedom, they saved and worked and bought other family members freedom. Also, that happened after the end of enslavement. Also, families looked for each other. They looked for each other. There's countless stories and accounts of families traveling state upon state, mothers trying to, and parents trying to find their children or their brothers or their sisters or their aunties. And then if they were lucky enough to find their family, these new kinship connections were formed when families weren't able to unite. So they started to create their own family units. And that was just some of the a couple of examples of our resilience.
wow,
Con- Concrete.
that's
Oh, go
deep.
ahead.
No, that's really deep, Alexandra. The new kinship connections formed when families were able to reunite. Like I know that you're gonna get to I'm connecting the dots in terms of when you were talking about like a communalism in the culture, but also that when people talk about the Black family not being nuclear, or the Black family, and that somehow being a negative thing, like that that part of that happened, like how do I say this, that happened because of enslavement, what I'm saying, like
Hmm.
if you're taking people and that happened because of enslavement, and so
So,
the
so you
communalism
have the
overcome it, but right.
yeah, yeah. So you like the whole concept, like within child welfare, right? Of fictive kin, right? Some of these same concepts. And then, interestingly enough, though, the nuclear family piece and the extended family, and where we'll get to it a little bit next, the multi-generational living, those are also African values that were retained, right? That is broader than just mother and father and the children. It's the entire extended family that's a part of the family unit. And
Well,
so
thank
the
God, because if you have, the society, like blowing up your families. You know, like if you have the society or the oppressor blowing up your families, it's the resilience comes from how do we put the pieces back together,
Together.
you know, and
Yep.
how do we thrive despite the fact that you know what would normally be perceived as like a decimation, you know.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think out of that, right, out of that same putting the pieces back together, and you see this a lot like in Reconstruction, especially when there was this like black people were thriving in Reconstruction. You had this one of the ways to do that was the multi-generational living, being able to share resources, also doing Reconstruction all the way through the Harlem Renaissance, up through segregation. Even now, like those of you who remember my friend came on that Katthe interviewed, a Diva Nadira, a Diva Naturals, right? This black businesses offering credit to families. So she does like discounts. It's not like credit, but it's the same concept where if you're unable to get something at the point, we're going to allow you to have credit and pay it back. Because again, it's that back to the study, it's that communalism, collective mentality. You know, we don't succeed unless all of us are succeeding. And then, of course, the Black church has been the safe place and a hub for resources, like a continual hub for resources. If you look, a lot of times, sometimes even the Black church is portrayed in a negative light, you know, in comedies and all of that. But if most Black churches, their ministries are thriving and centered around dealing with what the community needs. So they have prison ministries, they have food pantries, clothes pantries, um, youth programs, that African rites of passage, all of those things happen within the Black church that usually don't get highlighted, you know, in the mass media. Also the social connections, right? And they also talked about that with the coping and the value systems in the study, that the social connections that were formed really contribute to Black cultural strength. Like that is one of the ways that we were able to thrive. So the Black church, the fraternities, the sororities, the social clubs, like 100 Black women, the civic associations, and then the community activism organizations, right? So not only are they offering your social connections, but the activist organizations also offer these social connections and this one-mindedness about what needed to happen within our community to fight against whatever particular space we were in our history, whether it was enslavement to Jim Crow to civil rights to currently now prison industrial complex, etc. The social emotional competence. Katthe and I had a really interesting
Oh,
discussion around this one.
don't forget the art.
Oh, how could I forget that as an artist? Thank you. The formation, so the social connections, right? The formation of new artistic genres and venues as creative outlets. So art therapy before it was named art therapy, right? It's no secret that African American culture has birthed almost every cultural genre to include rock and roll. A lot of people don't know that, right? Or don't acknowledge that. Every cultural music genre in this country. And so you have things like the Harlem Renaissance, where it birthed jazz and all of these great writers that were also a place, because Harlem Renaissance correlates right with Jim Crow. It correlates with the summer of 1929 when there was all the lynchings. You have all of this, out of all this adversity and death and horror, these beautiful artistic genres being birthed, from the jazz, the poetry, and
Blues.
so, and then the venues, right? Because you couldn't go anywhere else. A lot of times they couldn't perform, except for in Europe. Like you have people would perform in Europe, but in America, you would have like in the country they called them like the juke joints. In the urban places, there would be social clubs or supper clubs that we had a chance to like appreciate and perfect these artistic genres.
And so blues is one, right? And hip hop. Like
And
and
hip hop.
turn people to Alexandra and Corrine a number of months ago did a webinar on hip hop and resilience in youth. But I think it's like this connection between the social connections and the resilience, because the ability to make art out of your suffering and struggle is a way of like getting in touch with your own truth about what's going on, you know, and being able to express it. and and create beauty in it is a huge source of resilience too, I think.
And
Yeah.
healing, right, healing. The whole concept of art therapy is that it can heal trauma,
Yeah.
right? And we looked at that after the fact, but we were kind of organically doing that, to heal the trauma as a way to get it out from not internalizing it.
And that's
Um,
my favorite anecdote about Rwanda. I probably have said it on more than one webinar, but like after the Rwandan massacre, they sent psychologists in, like Western psychologists, to help them deal with the trauma. And Andrew Solomon is one of those people who was there and it was hearing the story. And they said they didn't do any of the things that we know help people heal, like go out in the sunshine, like dance, like drum, like be together. Like they took us into these little rooms and made us tell the story of what happened to us. We had to ask them to leave. You know, we had
you
to ask them to leave.
re-traumatizing us.
Yeah, because and so I think of that. I think of like when just in real time, African culture meets Western culture, and the deep wisdom about healing and how to heal. You know, the conflict between those two, and the nature, the connection with nature and the connection with art being things that are actually healing and
Yeah,
help get through rough times.
and like the drums, right? Now you see these drumming circles. They're not just African Americans, like across cultures, that these drumming circles are a way for people to heal and express. And then we know through like the ACEs study and all the trauma informed work, right, that if you get your body moving, you actually are moving the trauma out of your body and helping your right and left brain start to communicate again. So again, it's like all of these concepts, which I think is so interesting that we've named them, which is great, right? But they've been organically happening within African American culture out of necessity, right? And I think just the beauty is the beauty of our strength. And so then the social emotional competence, shared power. There is a way in which an African Americans share power that I think it's different than the dominant culture. Um, you see that within, not that there aren't hierarchical structures, but even like I'll use the example of the Black church. A lot of people don't know that because of the stereotypes, but like mostly in most of the structures of the Black church, particularly the Baptist church, it's a democracy. It is not as if the pastor has the end all say be all. Actually, everything gets voted on. Things have to be made, like there's elders, and it has to be agreed upon. And so again, that shared power is still a transmission from African culture from the continent. Social emotional competence, empathy and compassion. Um, One of the things that I think is the beauty of African Americans is that regardless of what we have been through, we remain empathetic and compassionate even to those who have oppressed us, right? You see that happen. I think there was recently, I don't know, about a year ago, was something happened with some one of these like race crimes, and they were like, "How can this mother forgive? How can they forgive?"
With South
Because
Carolina with Dylan Roof, remember when he
yeah,
Bible study and he showed up and
exactly.
everybody and the families the next day I think were forgiving, and people were, and that's what brought the Confederate flag down in South Carolina back then. I mean, I remember that very clearly a couple of years ago, right?
Yeah, and the outrage of people like how you can forgive, right? But if we take it out of the realm of like race and culture, we know as practitioners that forgiveness a lot of times is not even really about the other person, right? It's about your own healing. And so I think one of the underlying reasons of the empathy, the compassion, and the forgiveness is because there's just no space. If you're dealing with all of these things going on that's constantly attacking you, there's no space to hold all of this because you would be mad if you did. So you have to release it. You have to forgive so you can move on to focus on how are we going to make this better for the next generation? What is it that we need to build within our communities so these things can change? And I think that's what our ancestors were doing and why we're at the point that we have a long way to go, but this is how we made it to this point that we are now. And then the generational storyteller, the things that have been passed along, Katthe is an anthropologist, you know, up until probably recently, if it wasn't written down, it wasn't history, it wasn't true, right? But that's kind of changed because the oral tradition is actually, to me, I think there's value in both, but the griot had to learn. It's a process. It wasn't like, oh, we just tell you the story and then it's like the telephone game and then it gets messed up at time it gets to you. But there was a process of how these stories were told. They had to be memorized. You had to have the competence and the capacity to keep the history and the culture sacred. And that's happened within our own communities, even within our family stories about things that our parents went through and our great grandparents went through. And that telling of those stories, I think, not just large history stories, but your actual family and how they were dealing with certain, the wider society and what they did to build creates and helps the social emotional competence of the children that hear those stories. And then trusting our intuition. Um, that goes back to like when the study was talking about the spirituality as a culture. I think we've had to trust our intuition. And when Katthe and I were talking about this, the greatest example of that to me is Harriet Tubman, right? Like, how did she do what she did? And how did she do that without all? Sometimes when it's dark outside, like when the lights went out here in Virginia, and of course everybody was melted down in the house. I'm like, dude, how did she go through all of these states? No lights, no street lights, no paved way, somewhat of a framework of a map, but she had to trust her intuition. And trusting your intuition is also, trusting whatever higher power you believe in, that you will be led in the right direction. And then the attentiveness to social cues. So being able to like read a room, I think, this is a skill that has developed in African American culture, particularly because of communalism, but also in response to, right? The double consciousness, for those who are familiar with that concept, it's W. Du Bois, who's one of our great leaders of Pan-Africanism. He also was a sociologist, and he talked about how Black people have to move. Now what they say in modern day, they talk about code switching. You hear that? But it's a little bit more than code switching. It's not just about language and, oh, I use my professional talk over here, and, oh, I use my ebonics over here. It's about a conscious to be able to navigate within your own culture and the dominant culture in order to be successful. And so a byproduct of that is being able to like read the room, to understand how people are feeling and being able to maneuver through that for whatever your end goal is.
That could be like connected to the racism related coping too. You know what I'm saying? Like you have to be able to differentiate, have a fine-tuned way of differentiating danger, and in order to be able to survive, in early in back in the day, or maybe even now, so
Yeah,
like that, so you develop that skill and you refine it, um because it's part of sustainability. It's part of sustaining your family, knowing when something's
yeah,
wrong.
and it makes me think, Katthe, about what Dr. Joy talked about and what we talked about in parenting, right? Like your experiences when you all was doing strengthening families. Sometimes what people view as the mother being too harsh, like, oh, you have to stay close to me, is about survival. You have to be, and it's not, it's actually a protection because of the environment, not necessarily being abusive. And I think a lot of things are birthed out of that. She talked about, like, making sure, parents, like, don't look this way or don't look that way. You have to look straight ahead because certain things could cost you your life in the era of Jim Crow and segregation. So again, all of that to me falls under that attentiveness, being attentive to social cues. So next slide, Selena. So it's now time to hear from you a little bit. What are other examples in Black history that illustrate how Black families and communities overcame adversity? You can put it in the chat, or Selena will, if you raise your hand, she'll unmute you and you can join the conversation with Katthe and I. Oh, I'm seeing some of the chat. Thank you, ladies.
It takes people a little while to think about questions, especially when the questions are nuanced.
Yes, well, thank you, May, and thank you, Andrew and Maria, for your comments.
I guess I just ask another question to people. Is this, Andrew says, I'm currently reading The Warmth of Other Suns, and I've been blown away by the story of the Great Migration and the resiliency that Black families showcased.
Yes. And so the Great Migration is when a lot of African Americans left the South and moved into cities like Chicago and New York, into LA in order to like seek better opportunities. A lot of times too, because that was around the same time that you had like the land grab from the black farmers, where a lot of their, through the sharecropping, they had lost their land, and so it was like, look, let's go now because you have the Industrial Revolution happening at the same time. So definitely fascinating, Andrew. I agree.
Well, I know that this is, we don't want to ground everything in the Middle Passage, but how can you not think of resilience when you think of how African Americans got here as slaves? You know, like how could that doesn't seem even survivable to me. The more I learned about it, and the more I learned about the conditions that people were in, that people were in,
Hmm.
it doesn't even seem like just
Yeah.
survivable. You
I
know,
always say that, it was like only one, it depends on two where they were going. So like some accounts like one out of three, some it was maybe less than that, like that actually survived. So when you get to this Western hemisphere, you are like the strongest of the strongest of the strongest that
yeah.
actually survived because so many people died or chose to commit suicide, in order not to, once they figured out what was going on. But the people who made it here, and then when you got here, then you had the whole being adjusted and the things that were happening on the auction block. So yeah, it's the actual Middle Passage and being here to even have me here talking is like strength beyond strength.
Yeah. Maria says, I'm not sure if this answers the question, but I think about the white allies that helped. I don't think, I think like what I'm thinking about is also how, and I can't remember who said it. I keep thinking Angela Davis was the one that said it, but I haven't been able to find it when I Google it. But somebody pointed out, somebody important, social activist pointed out, African American, that black nannies, black women raising the children of white, of people, whether it was like the slave owners or whether it was like the, just in the South or whatever. um that's extraordinary when you really think about it, like trusting, and it says a lot about the culture, that empathy and compassion, when you were talking about like the protective factors and the empathy and compassion and forgiveness, like that you wouldn't hold it against the child, you know what the what the adults are doing,
Hmm.
and that you would, that we you that so many nurturers, so many people being, having their, so many white privileged people having their primary relationship as a small child be with an African American woman, you know.
Right, and so like, and it's so ironic, right? One is because you see humanity. It's almost like the same thing with the indigenous peoples here. Like there was no idea of what was going to happen. It's like, oh, you're another human. Same thing with colonization in Africa. Oh, you're another human. We're not really looking at like that. We see here, your humanity first. And then Kawana is saying, yeah, the children
Yeah.
are innocent,
Well, yeah,
right?
that's not, I'm just saying, like, there is also, certain people have the idea that the children are, you need to get rid of the children because they're going to become adults. Like I'm just saying, like, I'm Jewish, so in the Holocaust and stuff, Germans didn't think that the Jewish children were innocents. They thought that they were, the they were going to grow into Jewish adults, and so they also needed to be exterminated, you know? So like this
Yeah.
concept of, but the children are innocent, that Kwana you're putting forward is part of African cultural, you know, thought process, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Because there's some intuitive. I think that that it's a learned. Everything is a learned behavior.
And Jennifer says, watching your family and friends be abused or killed and living through it and staying strong in the past and today.
Definitely.
Dealing with.
I think another example of how Black families in history overcame adversity would be. I was talking to Robert. We were talking yesterday. I'm trying to remember what other examples. Andrew talked about the Great Migration. Um, there's so many. I think there's just so many examples.
May says, Black families learned what to do to survive, but also worked to do what was necessary to be free. Family meant everything to Black families.
Oh, another example was the bringing people into your home, right? So even my mother, like in the 80s and 90s, we would have like random people. They're not random. It would be random though, that would come, that she would feed, that she would take care of, that she would help get on their feet. Going back to that collective mentality, or like when we weren't able, my dad was talking about, Black people built the network of where people could stay doing segregation and open their homes up. So when you're traveling from one place to another, you knew whose house to stop at, where you could take a shower, where you could sleep. It was like Black hotels, Black bed and breakfasts, for lack of a better example. But I think that's another example of how we have the ability to travel long distances, and not have to stay in your same community where there was nowhere for you to stay when you got tired.
Let's go because we're
Next.
we're gonna run out of time.
How did that happen? Okay, let's go through family and community sustainability in African American culture. So, some of the ways that we sustained our community, supporting Black farmers. Even now, right, there's like ad hoc farm stands that happen in church parking lots. The mutual aid societies, Katthe talked about them when we did the webinar on mobilizing mutual assistance, because there weren't Black run charitable or philanthropic
They weren't
organizations.
even eligible. Like African
Mhm.
Americans, Blacks weren't eligible to receive government help back in the day, in the late 1800s. And so that in New Orleans, there are like 150 African American mutual aid societies that sprung up, you know, to deal with that because
hmm And then urban gardens in the backyard before they were urban gardens. My grandparents lived in the south side of Chicago. They had a garden for as long as I can remember. My mother had a garden, and it was also a way to like balance your resources. The collective mind state that the study also talked about. So again, sharing food resources, that whole concept of the cup of sugar from the neighbor, very real thing. Particularly in when the neighborhoods before integration, bartering and trading. That still happens. That happened at the African American faith-based nonprofit that I ran before. We bartered the Black nonprofits. We had not as much funding. We bartered and trade services and put it in the MOU, but it was strictly a barter and trade. In-home childcare by relatives, right? This shared child care. The study talked about that as well. Caring for your elders within your home, right? No, up until some point there was no, and even now, like, no, you're not going to the nursing home. You're going to stay with me. Back to the multi-generational living. Of course, there's studies that show when you have elders and children talk, there's a great thing that happens there, with both of their health and mental well-being. The intentionality of supporting Black businesses after segregation, because there wasn't a choice before, but after segregation, that's even happened now. That's even happening with this whole diversity and equity and inclusion. Like here in Richmond, we have 75 Black restaurants. 75 restaurants closed. None of them were Black. To Maria's point, that didn't happen just because of Black people. That also it happened because of white customers that were intentional because of everything that's happened of supporting these Black restaurants and businesses. And then I also already talked about allowing relatives and friends who were struggling to stay in their homes so they could get back on their feet. Um, what are some other ways African Americans practice family and community sustainability?
We have a couple in the chat, Amanda and Roy Banks. I don't know whether it's Amanda or Roy, but I'm thinking probably Amanda. I was watching a documentary about how Black people joined together to bury themselves when there was hardly any funeral homes for them. So Black burial societies, you know. And Portia says, yes, we call it make do. People make a way out of no way.
Yes, that's the way out of no way, boy. That's a I heard that all my growing up all my life.
Sunday dinners at Big Mama's house, May says.
They even talked about that in the study, and about the importance of the gatherings on Sundays. If you see some more, you can
Yeah, I'll
think
tell
of some more. Put in the chat. Next slide. So, Andrew, you'll like this. This picture is like came from the Black migration uh, to the left. You were talking about that. What difference does it make to view Black history through this lens, right? It's very similar to viewing parents and families as the expert of what they need. What difference does it make to viewing Black history through this strength-based, resilience-based perspective versus, oh, they were just victims of all of these horrible things, and instead of talking about the things that made us strong? What difference do you think it'll make?
Well, one thing that while people are thinking and going to write, one thing that I think it does, Alexandra, is first of all, it makes a connection between Black history and the history of other immigrants. You know, it kind of normalizes it. You know, I'm not saying like in terms of like you see connections between, you know, Chinese mutual aid societies and collectivist mentality, or Jewish, what the Jewish people did, you know, when they first came to the Lower East Side and how they dealt with, you know, so it kind of like it kind of makes bridges between immigrant communities, and in a way, you know, that you
Mm-hmm.
only, if you only focus on slavery, like then it's it has, there's pluses and minuses, right, to only focusing on slavery. And I know when you were preparing this, you're like, I don't want to talk about Black history only about slavery, because that's always what's done. The other thing that's usually done is you point out, like, you know, what's his name, George Washington Carver, and you know the different, like, different inventors, and W.E.B. Du Bois, and we have, you know, and Harriet Tubman, and you know, like which isn't, I'm not saying it's a bad thing to recognize how brilliant and creative and what the contributions that have been made by African Americans, but it's like on the one hand you have slavery and then you have superstars, you know, and what I think looking at Black history through this lens does is it really focuses on the experience of ordinary people and allows everybody to see that the culture as on the whole is an extremely positive one, you know.
And so your point, Katthe, and we don't even really get into they don't even get into the full stories of the quote unquote superstars, right? It's like little pieces, just little, and not even their humanity in their lives. So
Yeah,
Jennifer said using empowering language. Yes, definitely.
I think it's like, and we're going to talk more about this next week, Alexander, but I think it's like when you think about how history is created and the story, like what the story is and what the prevailing narrative is, like and I've had conversations as an ally. I have had conversations with people. I think I don't want to like, I've had conversations with people who are looking at African American experience through a dominant culture lens or through stereotypes, and even being compassionate about it, but thinking about, you know, trauma. They'll talk about trauma, and they'll talk about multi-generational trauma, and they'll talk about slavery experience, and then they'll talk about how messed up everything is, you know. And I think that that's that contributes to a negative portrayal of Black culture, you know. and an assumption that there's much more pathology and toxicity than there actually is. Like, and so what
Agreed.
I would always say is, well, I know a lot of people who live on the south side of Chicago and are raising families and go to, have vibrant churches and Sunday dinners and have the same values you do, and are working hard, to support themselves, like me as a white ally talking to another white person. So I don't really see what you're seeing or what you're thinking is the norm, and
Hmm.
I think that it helps to have real experience with people, to be able to make that bridge. And Maria says it demonstrates the strength, wisdom, grit, creativity, versatility, ingenuity, diversity, and richness of the Black community, and its contribution to real American history. Yeah,
Yes, Maria.
let's go, Maria. And it's also like, I guess that's where I was going, Alexandra, with the contributions thing. When you say it's not only that they don't tell about the lives of the people, but there's just a small handful that get promoted, instead of, and that's why I thought like the movie Hidden Figures was so important, because it was
Hmm.
like, who knew about those three women? Like they weren't, and what a huge contribution they made to the space program,
Yeah.
and they were ordinary people. They were ordinary people with ordinary jobs. They weren't inventors. They weren't, you know, superstars necessarily. They were hidden figures. And so it makes you think like there's a lot more of those. There's a lot more hidden figures.
There
And
are, there are, and I will say, as a student at Howard University and at the Springer Library, it's replete with all of that. It just does not get into the dominant textbooks, which is why, as we say all the time, Katthe, most people are like brainwashed to true history, particularly in the public school system.
right. So Andrew says, for me, it highlights the need to always remember that history is not static, it's a living, malleable force. And I love this quote. The past, as a concrete historical reality, must be viewed as an integral part of the process of unfolding total reality. The present must be perceived as part of the process constituted by a real historical past dissolving into a real historical future. Only when the present is seen as a continuation of a historical process, as part of history in flux, can the future be consciously shaped. That's deep, Andrew. That's deep.
Yeah, the thing that I just, out of all of that, I think is beautiful. That quote, you have to tell me where you got that from. But it talks, I think about, who tells the story, right? Which is what we're talking about.
Next.
Usually, who's perceived as the victors tell the story of history, which again, why that oral tradition, the generational storytelling, and Black historians and anthropologists and sociologists, and there's a lot of them, have been doing this work to try to fill in the narrative that doesn't get told. Next slide, please, Selena.
Well, and that one, I guess, Alexandra, it makes me think of, I took a lot of women's studies courses in college way back in the day. And, if you just take English, you're reading a lot of white, or in my day, 30 years ago, whatever, you're reading a lot of white men, and there's like no female Shakespeare. And that whole thing of like, why isn't there a female Shakespeare? Well, is it because women just don't have that talent? Or is it because of patriarchy? That women's talent isn't recognized, that there's a that it's not. And I think that there's an analogy there to African American history and contributions. That,
Definitely,
yeah. So
definitely. Um, Thank you, Andrew. So, how does viewing Black history through the strength-based lens impact the legacy of American families? I think we sort of hit on that. So, if someone wants to answer that, but I will kind of want to go to this next one. How can it be communicated to the next generation? This legacy, everything that we've talked about, particularly like you saying with Katthe, like a lot of times you have to get to college to hear about the Black scholars, right? And so in like, or to hear about the Black writers, or to even take it out of African American, all the contributions of African writers throughout history that doesn't get talked about. So how do we communicate um, this legacy of strength and this legacy of Black families being sustained in their communities and their families to the next generation?
and when you said, you put this question in here, Alexandra, you were talking about the next generation of all Americans, not
Oh,
African Americans. So, going back to the first slide and racial socialization, like teaching, and that's maybe the priority, is teaching African American children, the next generation, about the history and the legacy of their families and the strength of their culture. But it's also about how does the next generation, how does everybody like understand a, the view of African Americans through a strengths-based lens? How could we
mhm,
get that into our schools, our elementary schools and our high schools? And I think partly for me, it's also about critical thinking. Like I've been thinking a lot about this because I was having a conversation with somebody who was politically on the other side from me. Like we see things totally opposite. And he said to me, first he said, uh, you can't be saved. You're too far gone. I was like, thanks. And then he was like, um, I think the important part of what I'm trying to say is like, he said, we have different facts. And I think that that's interesting. The thought about different facts, like that people do pull together, string together the facts that make the story that they want to tell. And history, his story, is one way of looking at some of the facts. So it's like partly it's about getting more facts into play, like
definitely.
including more facts. And partially it's also about the critical thinking part is about realizing that there are facts and there are lies. Like, and we have to be able to differentiate between facts and lies. Like, so that I think about that in terms of Texas and the power going out, right? And the facts are that the grid is separate from federal regulation, that it's old, that it wasn't winterized, that they've been hearing since 2011 that they needed to improve it, but they had no economic
Political will.
incentive to do so or political will because it doesn't get cold that often. So the money they would have to spend updating it wouldn't be worth it. And yet the Republicans were very quick to say it's because of the alternative energy. It's the wind turbines. It's the solar panels that are screwing us up. And that's only 13% of the power. And it's not the truth. And they knew it wasn't the truth when they're saying it. But saying the other thing doesn't back up their story. So I think the question is like, and it's relative to this question too, is not only what facts, like including more facts, but also really differentiating facts from lies and not
Agreed.
and being able to call people on the lies that they're telling.
And I think also too to that point, like when I look at my own daughters who are 14, and because of what I have taught them, they're able to go in their space in school and counter that, right? And then they have friends of all different races who also counter that. So I am hopeful with this next generation because my colleague Robin we talk about this all the time. It's also proximity, she would say, like actually having relationships with people from a different culture creates a certain level of understanding and the incentive or the inspiration to go learn the facts out of
Right,
what you've been told. Yeah,
right.
definitely.
And Maria, this is a great way to end. She says, change the dominant narrative and piece together these stories that have not been told with the ones that have been shared. And then she said, speak, Katthe. So thanks, Maria.
So that we'll go through the next slide. I just want you to think about it, which is if how does this lens change the societal perceptions? I think we hit on that. But the last one, just to take with you, is how does this lens inform how we engage and support African American families in our work? If this
Oh,
became a part of our narrative. So just think about that. And maybe somebody will tell us something next week when Katthe and we're back here next week. And next slide, Selena. And really quickly, this is just an ending. It sums up exactly what we were talking about from one of my great poets that I love, Maya. It says, time for parents to teach young people early on that in diversity there's beauty and there's strength. We all should know that diversity makes for a rich tapestry, and we must understand that all the threads of the tapestry are equal in value, no matter their color. And I'll turn it over to you to end this
Thank
out,
you,
Katthe.
Alexandra. It was great. It was fun once again, and and really enjoyed having you, hosting you today, and presenting with you. So thank you very much. And please fill out the poll before you leave, and look forward to next week. Yoli's going to be here on Monday with Class 4, the sadness of grief. We're talking about accessing our emotions and exploring rhythm time in the natural world. She's using Chinese medicine as a template for understanding grief and working through grief. Um, and then Tuesday, Ruben Mabubi will be here. He's doing a 5-part series on holistic protection, keeping yourself and your family safe. And the first installment is next Tuesday. And then Guy and a number of our new staff members at Be Strong Families are going to be talking about welcoming newcomers and beginning work relationships during the pandemic. So we hope you'll all participate in that. It'll be interactive, and what's happening where you work and how do you get people together. And then Tonjo will be back on Thursday with keeping creativity alive in your home, assuming she has the power, because she's in Mississippi, but she's had a lot of ice storms and weather that's kept her from being able to present. And then we'll be back, Alexandra and me, next Friday on framing the narrative of Black history. And I just want to get to Amanda and Roy to say we need to get more African American history classes in our schools. My children didn't even know who Emmett Till was. It's not really being taught in schools, at least not in my state. We're watching down the history of our ancestors. My dad always said you have to know where you came from to know where you're going. And Andrew's amplifying historical resiliency. And I think we're going to be out in a second. Wear your mask. That's Andrew, and that's his wife, Michelle, who's an ICU nurse. The masks are great. They're very comfortable. They express your values. Get one on the Be Strong Family store. And if you or your colleagues would like to host a webinar with us, contact me. And thank you very much. It's 1:00 now. We appreciated your time. We'll see you next time. And Kawana says we definitely need more classes in school. Yes, we do. Take care, everybody.